Earth Day has been held on the 22nd of April every year since 1970, when a wave of protests took place in the wake of a California oil spill. In 1990, the movement went global, with the group claiming 200 million people were involved in 141 countries. Now, it's probably safe to say Earth Day has become a mixture of genuine protest and corporate virtue signalling. But even on that not especially demanding front, Business Secretary Kwarteng didn't meet the moment. He tweeted this: "I welcome BP's plan to develop the Murlach field in the North Sea. The transition to cheap, clean power can't happen overnight. We'll need oil and gas for decades. That's a matter of fact. I'd much rather we source more of our gas domestically." Earlier, I spoke to Dr. Ella Gilbert, an Antarctic climate scientist. I started by asking her to respond to Kwarteng.
Ultimately, we're only going to need to have fossil fuels in our energy mix if we do absolutely nothing to source alternatives. And it's quite a fallacy that we need to start investing in new fossil fuel technologies. In fact, the consensus of climate scientists suggests that it's actually quite the opposite. We need to start moving very rapidly away from fossil fuels, and that means completely phasing out coal. It means really quickly moving away from things like gas, not exploring in new fields, because that's completely the opposite direction to where we need to be going.
The argument he's obviously sort of leaning into is people recognizing that their gas has got more expensive. There's a war in Ukraine, and the argument for energy independence has got a lot stronger. Do you feel like the war in Ukraine has sort of benefited the fossil fuel industries, who now have a stronger argument for saying, let's actually invest more so that we don't have to import fossil fuels?
I feel like there's a bit of a tussle between, on the one hand, you have that argument where you have the fossil fuel industry suggesting that we should be investing in domestic gas supplies, for example. But then you also have the alternative, which is if we use this as an opportunity, a springboard to really plow our money into green technologies, to really ramp up our investment and switch our dependence from dirty gas to nice clean alternatives like solar and wind, for which we already have all the technology and the capability and, quite crucially, the resources to do so. If we stopped using so much gas and started using way more onshore wind, offshore wind, using the ample resources that we do already have, then that would be another way of tackling the same problem. And solar energy is the cheapest form of electricity. That was a conclusion come to by the International Energy Agency, which is renowned for being quite conservative. So worldwide, if we're ignoring some of the cheapest and most readily available and greenest sources of energy, then it seems like a bit of a slap in the face.
I'm not an expert on energy or climate change, but my understanding is solar and wind are the cheapest sort of sources of energy at the right time. So when the wind is blowing, obviously when the sun is shining, but that potentially we might need fossil fuels in smaller parts of the economy. So maybe as a backup fuel, or maybe for certain industrial processes like making cement, I think is quite hard to sort of do via renewables. Will there still be some residual parts of the economy, say, where fossil fuels will be necessary for a while?
Well, I should probably say as well, I'm not an energy expert either. And my understanding of that is true. I mean, renewables are intermittent in some places, and that's why we need a really diverse mix of different renewables. And that's why we need to invest in battery technology, which stores energy so that you can kind of plug those gaps and fill the troughs when you have less being generated from renewable sources. But I'm also not going to pretend that we can switch to 100% renewable overnight. That's not a realistic or feasible thing to say that we can do. But the fact remains that investing in new oil and gas and coal fields is completely nonsensical, and that we actually need to be really putting our investment money into developing those cleaner technologies that will help us in the future, overcoming those intermittency problems, producing a reliable base load of energy. But also, we have to remember that there's demand measures as well. So as long as we're consuming too much energy doing, frivolous things or wasting energy and, literally letting it fly out of the window, then that's going to push up our demand and going to mean that we're going to need more energy. And if we can cut the demand and make sure that any energy does come from those renewable sources, and invest in developing those sorts of renewable sources, then that's going to be the real solution.
And let's talk about your area of expertise, so Antarctica. We've read some, really scary headlines recently about areas of Antarctica being 40 degrees warmer than they usually would be. Could you talk about that and how scared we should be about statistics like that?
Yeah, so we've seen two quite alarming headlines, I would say, in the last month or so. So one of them was this heat wave you spoke about, where at the same time, actually, we had a heat wave in the Arctic, which was about 30 degrees above normal temperatures, and one in the Antarctic, the East Antarctic, which was about 40 degrees above average. And this was a heat wave that was kind of triggered by what we call an atmospheric river, which it basically is what it sounds like. So it's a really narrow band of snowfall in this case, because it's so cold, that forms, and it's like a river in the sky essentially. And as it pushes into the continent, it's associated with really warm temperatures, in this case extremely warm temperatures, and a huge amount of snowfall. So it was associated with a kind of particularly unusual weather event. But what has been said is that it could be indicative of things to come. The East Antarctic has until now been an extremely stable place where there haven't really been any noticeable temperature trends. The ice has been relatively stable. The natural processes are approximately in balance. But this is potentially a sign of things changing from that kind of stable picture. And another headline that you might have seen was the collapse of this ice shelf called the Conga ice shelf, which happened actually at the same time pretty much as the heat wave was noted. Interestingly, that is probably not related to the heat wave, because that ice shelf, which is basically a platform of ice that's floating on top of the ocean at the very edge of the Antarctic ice sheet, and it collapsed completely over the course of just 2 weeks. We think that had been progressively being destabilized. And this is part of the natural cycle of the ice sheet growing and bits breaking off the edge, essentially. But because we thought that the East Antarctic historically has been so stable and hasn't changed very much, this is again being touted as a kind of sign of things that might come in the future.
And as you say, the Antarctic has up to now been considered more stable. We hear more worrying news about the Arctic. What's your impression of how much sort of the extreme weather events we're seeing both in the Antarctic and the Arctic are feeding into policy? Do you think that politicians are sort of saying, oh, we could be reaching a tipping point, let's get more ambitious, or is this being sort of ignored by anyone other than the people in your quite specific scientific circles?
It's hard to know in some ways because you live in an echo chamber to some degree. But I do think that these sorts of extreme events are certainly making people open their eyes, wake up a little bit to the reality of this change. I think the danger with sort of putting too much emphasis on these really specific extreme events can be that it can breed apathy in a way, because people get so overwhelmed with the anxiety and the kind of the doom of all of these terrifying events, and almost the what ifs might happen, that it can be, you get paralyzed with fear in some ways. I do think that there is more action being taken, and that is on the part of businesses, governments, individuals particularly as well. I do think that things are starting to happen, but it's just not fast enough. And Kwarteng's tweet demonstrates how seriously they're taking this. They're not taking it seriously at all. If on the one hand you have the rapid loss of Arctic sea ice, you have heat waves in the Arctic, heat waves in the Antarctic, sea level rise, extreme weather events, people losing their lives due to climate-related disasters. And then on the other hand, you have a government minister suggesting that we invest in new fossil fuel fields. That's completely incongruent. It doesn't match up.